The winter wind screamed across the open fields west of Moscow, dragging snow in swirling columns that blurred the horizon. Somewhere among those endless white plains, German tank crews huddled in their steel giants, engine silent, breath freezing in the air. The outlines of the Kremlin's towers were only a few dozen miles away. Victory seemed so close that some soldiers claimed they could see the reflection of the city's lights at night. And yet, within days, that illusion would vanish into frost and silence. Hundreds of armored machines would remain motionless in the snow, not because of enemy shells, but because nature and human arrogance had joined forces against them. The story of why so many German tanks stood frozen near Moscow has been told 1,000 times as a legend. General Winter defeated Hitler. It's a phrase repeated in textbooks, documentaries, and casual conversations. But legends often hide the truth. What truly happened was far more complex and far more human. It wasn't simply the cold that stopped the most powerful army in Europe. It was a chain of miscalculations, pride, and denial, a slow-motion collapse that began long before the first snowflake ever fell. To understand how this happened, we have to go back to the summer of 1941, when confidence burned brighter than any campfire. The German invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, had been launched with unprecedented scale and precision. Nearly 4 million soldiers crossed the border, supported by thousands of tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces. It was, by any measure, the largest military operation in history. Within weeks, the Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable. Soviet divisions were surrounded by the dozens. Entire cities fell in days. Berlin's newspapers printed headlines predicting victory before Christmas. Officers joked that they would celebrate the new year in the Kremlin. This confidence was more than just enthusiasm. It was institutional. The German High Command planned the campaign under the assumption that it would be swift, a lightning strike that would end before the autumn rains. They calculated fuel consumption, supply routes, and vehicle maintenance based on this short timetable. No one seriously considered what would happen if the war continued into the Russian winter. The assumption was simple: it wouldn't. But wars have a way of ignoring assumptions. As the summer pushed into autumn, the first signs of trouble appeared. The roads of the Western Soviet Union weren't roads in the European sense. They were long dirt tracks that turned to thick clay when the rains came. When autumn arrived, the Rasputitsa, the infamous sea of mud, swallowed everything. German trucks sank to their axles. Horses collapsed trying to drag artillery guns through the muck. Soldiers spent hours digging vehicles out, only to have them stuck again a few hundred meters later. The supply lines, already stretched thin across hundreds of miles, began to choke. Fuel that was supposed to reach the front sat stranded miles behind. Spare parts never arrived. Food grew scarce. Still, the advance continued. Commanders urged their men forward, believing that if they just pushed a little harder, the campaign could end before the cold arrived. They were chasing a finish line that no longer existed. By late October, temperatures began to drop. The mud hardened overnight, which at first seemed like a blessing. Tanks could move again. Trucks could drive without sinking. But within days, that blessing turned to a curse. What had been mud became ice. Metal contracted. Rubber cracked. Fuel thickened in the lines. The mighty German war machine, built for speed and coordination, was slowing to a crawl. Inside the tanks, the crews discovered new problems every morning. Engines refused to start. Oil congealed like wax. The batteries that powered the starters lost charge in the freezing air. Mechanics lit fires beneath engines just to warm them enough to crank. Some poured alcohol into the fuel lines or diluted the oil with gasoline to keep it liquid. These improvisations worked for a few hours, sometimes for a single battle, before the machinery seized again. Meanwhile, Soviet T-34 tanks rolled through the snow with far fewer issues. Their diesel engines were more resilient in low temperatures. Their wider tracks distributed weight more evenly, allowing them to move over snowdrifts that trapped German Panzers. And their crews, dressed in thick quilted uniforms, endured conditions that left many of their opponents half-frozen and exhausted. But the problem went deeper than machines or clothing. It was psychological. The German army, which had swept across Europe with precision and confidence, now found itself trapped in a landscape that obeyed none of its rules. The same discipline that once ensured victory now worked against it. Orders to advance or hold positions were carried out even when common sense screamed to stop and regroup. The High Command refused to admit that the plan had failed. That refusal became deadly. Even as reports poured in about broken equipment, missing supplies, and extreme fatigue, the push toward Moscow continued. Hitler himself insisted that the Soviet capital could still be taken, that one final effort would break the Red Army's back. His generals hesitated but obeyed. And so, in November 1941, the last major German offensive toward Moscow began under a sky already filled with snow. The men who fought in that campaign would later recall it as a march into a white void, endless cold, endless exhaustion, endless waiting for orders that made no sense. The tanks rolled forward, engines groaning, tracks creaking. Behind them, the frozen earth held the footprints of an army that had already gone too far. The myth of General Winter was about to be born. The first snow fell silently, coating everything in a thin white shell that reflected the dull winter sun. At first, it felt almost beautiful. Soldiers wrote in their diaries about how peaceful the front looked compared to the chaos of the summer battles. But that beauty was deceptive. Within a week, temperatures plunged below freezing, then lower still. The soft snow hardened into ice. The wind became a blade that cut through every layer of fabric. Engines stopped. Guns jammed. Even breathing felt like swallowing glass. The German army had no winter uniforms. Many soldiers still wore the same thin grey coats they'd been issued in France. Some wrapped themselves in curtains taken from abandoned houses. Others layered newspapers under their tunics for insulation. Boots froze solid overnight, and rifles cracked when fired because the metal had become brittle from the cold. What was once a proud, disciplined army now looked like a column of exhausted men shivering in mismatched rags, trudging through a blizzard that had no end. Every small mechanical failure became a life-threatening crisis. If a tank engine stopped for too long, the oil froze inside, and it could take hours to restart. Crews had to keep their machines running day and night, even when they were not moving. The constant roar of engines filled the night, echoing through the forests and across the frozen plains. Men slept next to the warm metal, hoping the heat would keep them alive. The smell of burning fuel mixed with frost and smoke hung over the camps like a fog. Yet despite everything, orders still came from above. Advance. The capital is close. The enemy is breaking. Push forward. The soldiers obeyed, though most already knew the truth. The Red Army was not breaking, it was regrouping. Every mile forward was costing lives and equipment that could never be replaced. But turning back was unthinkable. The army was trapped between pride and survival. On the other side, Soviet forces were learning fast. Engineers studied captured German tanks, noting how their engines stalled in the cold, how their lubricants thickened. They adapted. Diesel engines were easier to start in freezing weather. Soviet mechanics drained oil at night and kept it inside heated shelters. Their tanks had wider tracks that didn't sink into snow. For every German machine left stranded, a Soviet one appeared in motion, rumbling confidently through the frost. As the German supply lines stretched farther, the delays grew catastrophic. A tank division might have fuel for 2 days but wait 10 for resupply. Trains carrying parts and ammunition were halted miles away because locomotives froze on the tracks. Horses, still the backbone of transport, collapsed in the snow. Food ran out. Soldiers boiled snow for water and ate frozen bread so hard they had to chop it with bayonets. It wasn't just the cold destroying them. It was the distance, the denial, the illusion that this was still a campaign, not a slow disintegration. By mid-November, the once smooth machinery of Operation Barbarossa had become a patchwork of improvisation. Commanders begged for antifreeze, winter clothing, and proper fuel. Little arrived. German industry had not prepared for these conditions because no one in Berlin believed the war would still be going on. Even the propaganda shifted tone. The triumphant headlines of summer were replaced by cautious optimism, and then by silence. Meanwhile, Soviet civilians in Moscow dug trenches, built barricades, and prepared for street fighting. Stalin stayed in the city to show defiance, and that single act strengthened the will of millions. Reinforcements from Siberia, troops trained and equipped for winter warfare, began to arrive. They brought with them not only fresh energy but experience in surviving and fighting in temperatures that the invaders could barely endure. At night, German soldiers could hear the distant rumble of trains bringing those new troops. The sound was faint but unmistakable. For many, it was the sound of realization, the awareness that the tide was turning. The confidence that had fueled them since June was gone. In its place came silence, interrupted only by the wind and the distant echo of Soviet artillery. Tank crews tried everything to keep moving. They poured boiling water into engines, used torches to heat oil pans, even lit small fires under the hulls despite the risk. Some tanks managed to crawl forward, but at terrible cost. Metal cracked, tracks snapped, and entire battalions found themselves immobilized in open fields. The Panzers that had once raced across Europe now stood as frozen monuments to misjudgment. And still, orders came: hold the line. No retreat. No surrender. The men obeyed, not out of faith but habit. They were soldiers, and soldiers followed orders, even when those orders made no sense. Every morning, the officers repeated the same routines: inspection, repair, advance, as if ritual alone could keep the army alive. But nature was indifferent. The frost deepened, the days shortened, and the sky turned a permanent shade of grey. By late November, the dream of reaching Moscow was fading fast. The capital's towers were still visible on clear days, a ghostly reminder of how close victory had seemed. But between that city and the German front line lay a frozen graveyard of machines, hundreds of tanks, half buried in snow, their crews long gone or reassigned. Each one told the same story, a journey that began in confidence and ended in stillness. Some soldiers began to whisper that the cold itself was alive, that it punished arrogance, that it protected the Russian soil. It was superstition, of course, but it gave shape to what everyone felt. They were fighting against something more than just an army. They were fighting against the land, the weather, and the limits of human endurance. And the land was winning. The advance toward Moscow had slowed to a crawl, but the orders never stopped. Maps on the tables of German command posts still showed arrows pointed east, as if the frozen earth and exhausted soldiers were just temporary inconveniences. Officers spoke in confident tones, masking the unease that spread through the ranks. Every kilometre gained now felt like a victory carved from ice, each mile paid for with failing engines and dwindling strength. The soldiers were no longer fighting for glory or ideology. They were fighting for heat, for food, for the simple act of surviving another night. At dusk, men gathered around the faint glow of small fires, forbidden but necessary. They shared stories of home, spoke softly of summer days that now felt like another lifetime. When the flames died, darkness returned, and the frost crept in again, whispering through the cracks of their shelters. By early December, the thermometer dropped lower than anyone had thought possible, 30 degrees below freezing, sometimes more. In those conditions, steel turned fragile, and even breath became a visible struggle. Yet orders persisted. Commanders demanded movement, believing that perseverance alone could bend the weather to their will. But the weather didn't bend. It broke them, quietly, methodically, without malice or mercy. Many soldiers began to notice that the Soviets seemed almost untouched by the cold. It wasn't that they didn't feel it. No one could escape the sting of the Russian winter, but they had adapted to it. Soviet troops wore thick fur-lined coats and felt boots. They built fires openly, used sleds for transport, and slept in dugouts lined with straw. They were fighting on home ground, against an enemy that had underestimated everything. The contrast was impossible to ignore. A German soldier would struggle to move through the snow while a Soviet counterpart glided past on skis. German rifles jammed, bolts frozen solid, while Soviet weapons fired without pause. The difference wasn't magic or fate, it was preparation. The Red Army had learned from its defeats, adjusted, and returned stronger. The Wehrmacht, built on precision and efficiency, found itself trapped by its own rigidity. Behind the front, the logistical situation grew desperate. Fuel arrived in frozen barrels that had to be thawed before use. Ammunition was delayed by weeks, sometimes lost entirely in snow-covered roads. Medical units lacked supplies, and frostbite cases multiplied faster than they could be treated. For every soldier struck by a bullet, several more were lost to exposure. Officers tried to keep discipline, but even discipline began to freeze. Patrols disappeared into the snow, never to return. Communication lines broke, radios failed, and the sound of engines was replaced by the silence of immobility. Entire divisions became islands in a sea of white, cut off from each other, unable to move or call for help. Still, the army held its positions, because the alternative, retreat, was forbidden. Hitler's orders were absolute, no step backward. The line would hold or be buried where it stood. And so the soldiers stayed, waiting for supplies that never came, waiting for spring that felt impossibly far away. In some places, German units shared the same villages with Soviet partisans hiding in nearby forests. At night, both sides listened to the same howling wind, both wondering who would endure longer. The war, once defined by motion and blitzkrieg, had turned into a slow, frozen stalemate. And then, Just as despair settled in completely, the silence was broken. It began as distant thunder, faint, rhythmic, impossible to mistake. Artillery. The Soviets had launched their counteroffensive. From the north, east, and south, waves of Red Army troops advanced through the snow, supported by tanks that moved with surprising ease. Their engines roared in defiance of the cold, their tracks biting into the frost like claws. German soldiers scrambled to respond, but many of their weapons were still frozen. Tanks that could have held the line refused to start. Communications broke down in minutes. Chaos spread faster than orders could be given. What had been a defensive position turned into a rout. The very ground that had trapped the Germans now carried their pursuers forward. For the first time since the invasion began, the Wehrmacht was forced backward on a massive scale. The myth of invincibility cracked under the weight of frozen steel and broken morale. In some sectors, Soviet troops advanced 10, 20, even 30 miles in days. The same weather that had crippled the invaders now shielded the defenders, allowing them to move swiftly where the enemy could not. But the counterattack was more than just a military maneuver. It was psychological retribution. The Red Army's march through the snow was a statement that the land itself was reclaiming what had been taken. Villagers who had hidden during the occupation now emerged from the forests to greet Soviet soldiers with tears and relief. For them, it was not only survival, it was the beginning of hope. The German command tried to regroup, but coordination had collapsed. Some officers ordered strategic withdrawals. Others still clung to impossible directives from above. The result was confusion, units retreating without support, others holding positions long after they should have moved. In the chaos, the legend of 300 frozen tanks was born. On the outskirts of Moscow, entire armored divisions were immobilized, their engines silent, their crews gone. Some tanks were buried under snowdrifts so high they looked like small hills. To those who saw them, it appeared as if the cold itself had struck them down. In truth, it was neglect, exhaustion, and a refusal to face reality that had sealed their fate. When the Soviets advanced past them, they found fields littered with these metallic husks, once symbols of unstoppable force, now silent monuments to human miscalculation. The myth of General Winter was complete. But behind that myth lay something colder than frost, the truth of how arrogance freezes into defeat. The snow no longer fell softly. It came in waves, thick enough to erase the horizon. German soldiers trudged through it like shadows, their outlines barely visible against the endless white. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the land itself wanted to hold them in place. The tanks, once the pride of the army, stood half-buried in snowbanks, their turrets frozen in awkward positions. The crews who had once cared for them with precision now walked past in silence, too numb to look back. Inside the German headquarters, the maps were being redrawn every hour. Red arrows representing Soviet forces spread outward like cracks in glass. Each report from the front was worse than the one before. Commanders described entire regiments that had vanished, fuel depots that had been abandoned, and tanks left behind simply because they could no longer move. There was no talk of victory now, only of survival. For the first time, the myth of German efficiency began to unravel. The army that had prided itself on organization and precision found itself improvising at every turn. Mechanics used candles to warm frozen tools. Soldiers cut up aircraft tires to make soles for their boots. Officers who once gave orders with authority now begged for supplies that would never arrive. Even radio operators struggled, their equipment so cold that the wires snapped when touched. And yet, amid the collapse, something remarkable persisted: discipline. The men still followed orders. They still marched, repaired, and dug trenches, even when logic said to stop. It was a kind of stubbornness, a refusal to admit defeat, born not of hope but of habit. Every soldier clung to the belief that somehow the situation would change, that reinforcements would arrive, that the storm would end. But the storm was not ending. It was only beginning. By December 5th, the Soviet counteroffensive had gathered full momentum. Siberian divisions, fresh, experienced, and properly equipped, smashed into the German flanks. These troops, hardened by winters far colder than this, moved with speed and coordination that stunned the enemy. They wore white camouflage suits, blending perfectly into the snow. From a distance, it seemed as if the storm itself had come alive, carrying soldiers in its wake. German defenders fired until their guns jammed, then fell back to hastily dug positions. But there was no time to rest. Soviet tanks rolled forward, their diesel engines roaring steadily while the German vehicles stood silent and cold. In many areas, German units had no anti-tank weapons left, forcing them to fight with grenades or improvised explosives. Even so, they resisted fiercely, driven by training and fear more than strategy. The retreat was chaotic. Roads disappeared under snow, and markers were lost in the wind. Units became separated. Some never reappeared. Those who managed to withdraw often did so without their heavy equipment. Tanks and trucks were abandoned in deep drifts, their tracks and wheels locked in ice. Commanders made the grim decision to destroy them with explosives rather than let them fall into enemy hands. The muffled booms echoed across the frozen plains, each one a farewell to another piece of the army that had once seemed unstoppable. Back in Moscow, church bells rang for the first time in months. The Soviet capital had survived. The enemy was not only halted but pushed back. For millions of citizens, it felt as if the city itself had been reborn from frost and fear. The streets filled with people despite the cold, their breath-forming clouds of relief. The world had changed overnight. In Berlin, the news was received with disbelief. The propaganda machine struggled to frame the setback as temporary. Official statements spoke of strategic repositioning and weather difficulties, carefully avoiding the word that everyone already knew: failure. Behind closed doors, the high command argued about who was to blame. Some pointed to logistics, others to leadership, and a few dared to mention the obvious, that the entire plan had been built on fantasy. But among the soldiers at the front, blame no longer mattered. They were too busy trying to stay alive. Every morning began with the same grim ritual: clearing snow from the weapons, checking the engines, searching for anything that still worked. Men shared gloves, traded rations, and counted bullets like currency. The war had lost all trace of grand strategy. It had become a daily struggle against the elements. Even the simplest actions became monumental tasks. Lighting a fire risked drawing enemy attention, but without it, men froze. Moving a tank required hours of preparation, warming the engine with torches and boiling water. Communication between units was so unreliable that soldiers often learned of their own retreats from Soviet broadcasts. The Soviets, by contrast, grew stronger with every passing day. Their supply lines shortened, their morale soared, and their leaders understood that the psychological advantage was now theirs. They pushed forward relentlessly, not just to reclaim ground, but to prove that the invincible could bleed. For the Germans, each mile of retreat carried a different kind of weight, the weight of disbelief. Only months earlier, they had been conquerors. Now, they were fugitives of their own ambition, fleeing from an enemy they had dismissed as inferior. It was not just the loss of territory that stung, it was the shattering of identity. As the year came to an end, the temperature dropped even further. Frost covered the abandoned tanks like armor made of glass. Inside some of them, diaries were found, pages describing the cold, the exhaustion, and the disbelief that such a mighty force could be undone by something as simple as weather. Those tanks became monuments long before the war ended, symbols of a truth no one wanted to face, that even the strongest steel bends when arrogance becomes its core. By the time the sun returned, it brought no warmth. Its pale light merely revealed the scale of what had happened. Roads once filled with the thunder of armored columns were now silent trails marked by wreckage. Frozen trucks leaned against snowbanks like forgotten toys. Artillery guns stood in neat rows, their barrels coated with frost, the outlines of boot prints fading beside them. What had begun as the most ambitious offensive in history had transformed into a slow retreat through a landscape of silence. The soldiers who remained understood that the campaign for Moscow was over. Yet the idea of retreat carried a weight almost as heavy as the cold itself. Hitler's orders to hold every position still echoed through the ranks. To fall back was to disobey, and disobedience was not part of the German military language. But as temperatures dropped and supplies vanished, survival began to speak louder than discipline. Commanders made decisions in the shadows, quiet withdrawals, hidden from official reports, disguised as tactical realignments. Among the tank crews, hope had turned into routine. They still performed maintenance each morning, brushing snow from the hulls, checking engines that hadn't turned over in weeks. Some wrote messages on the sides of their machines, names of loved ones or prayers for luck. Others simply stared at the frozen horizon, waiting for orders that would never come. The tanks were no longer weapons. They were shelters, places to hide from the wind. The reality of the situation began to sink in slowly. For every division that managed to retreat, another was encircled. For every convoy that arrived, two more disappeared in the snow. The German war machine, once the model of precision, had fractured into 1,000 isolated struggles for survival. And in those fragments, something unexpected emerged: humanity. Soldiers who once believed themselves invincible began to see each other not as conquerors, but as companions in endurance. Letters home reflected this transformation. Gone were the confident boasts of quick victory. Instead, they spoke of cold nights, broken equipment, and the longing for warmth. "The frost is our real enemy," one wrote, "and it attacks us every hour." Censorship removed most such lines, but the truth spread nonetheless. Even those far from the front began to understand that something was deeply wrong. Meanwhile, the Soviets pressed forward with growing confidence. Their tanks advanced where German ones could not. Their supply lines functioned, their morale soared. For every frozen machine the Germans left behind, the Red Army gained another lesson in how to fight and survive in conditions that defied logic. They learned to use the snow itself as an ally, for camouflage, for insulation, even for ambush. The land that had swallowed the invaders now nourished its defenders. In one village west of Kalinin, a small group of German engineers tried to repair a line of disabled Panzers. They worked for hours, lighting fires under engines, pouring boiling water into oil systems, anything to bring life back into the machines. Finally, one engine roared to life, sputtering and coughing smoke into the frozen air. For a brief moment, there was applause, a flicker of triumph. But when the tank tried to move, its transmission snapped in half from the cold. The sound was like breaking glass, sharp, final, and unbearable. The men stood in silence, staring at the vehicle as the engine died again. That sound became the soundtrack of the winter campaign, steel giving up under the weight of its own design. The retreat was now impossible to hide. Even propaganda could not disguise the truth when entire divisions disappeared from the maps. The proud offensive name Operation Typhoon, the final push toward Moscow, became bitterly ironic. The only storm left was the blizzard that chased the soldiers back. Inside field hospitals, the consequences of the cold were visible in every cot. Men lay wrapped in blankets, their hands bandaged, their faces pale and expressionless. Doctors worked without proper supplies, melting snow for water, tearing up uniforms for bandages. There was no triumph left in their eyes. Only exhaustion. The war that had once promised glory now offered nothing but endurance. Back in the cities of Germany, civilians were told to be patient, that spring would bring renewal and victory. But in the east, spring felt like a myth. The cold was not just weather anymore. It was an identity. The landscape had become a living entity, shaping the fate of armies and men alike. The soldiers stopped seeing the war as movement from place to place. It had become static, a contest between will and temperature, between preparation and denial. When the Soviets finally recaptured towns and villages, they often found the remnants of German positions abandoned overnight. In the ruins, they discovered notes, equipment, and sometimes tanks with engines still faintly warm, signs of hasty withdrawal. The Red Army's advance was not just a pursuit. It was a reclaiming of dignity, a reversal of humiliation. Every village retaken was a reminder that even the strongest army could falter when it failed to respect the environment it fought in. As the year closed, the front stabilized west of Moscow. The Germans had been pushed back more than 100 miles. Their offensive power was broken, their myth of invincibility shattered. But beyond the lines of battle, deeper lessons were being written. Lessons about arrogance, adaptability, and the limits of human control. The frozen tanks outside Moscow were not simply the remains of a failed campaign. They were symbols of a deeper truth, that no empire, no ideology, no machine can outlast nature's indifference. The silence that followed the retreat was unlike any other in the war. It was not the silence of peace, nor the silence of defeat, but something heavier, the quiet of realization. The men who had marched toward Moscow in summer now looked upon their frozen world and understood what they had truly been fighting. Not just an enemy, but their own belief that they could conquer everything. The new year dawned without celebration. The snowdrifts along the front lines were higher than men's shoulders, the sky a permanent shade of grey. No one talked about victory anymore. They talked about endurance, about how long the human body could keep functioning in this frozen purgatory. The sound of battle had changed, too. It was quieter now, muffled by snow, punctuated only by the dull thud of distant artillery and the groan of ice shifting under tank treads that no longer turned. What had once been a campaign of movement had become a monument to stillness. The frozen Panzers stood as landmarks on a battlefield that refused to move forward or backward. The men who had once driven them walked past on foot, wrapped in whatever rags they could find, faces hidden behind scarves of frost. They no longer saluted officers. They simply nodded, each acknowledging the other as survivors of something beyond orders or politics. At night, the cold crept into everything: uniforms, food, weapons, thoughts. Soldiers learned to sleep in brief intervals, afraid that if they lay still too long, they might not wake up. Letters home were shorter now, written in a trembling hand, their words stripped of hope. "We are still here," many wrote, "but the land does not want us." The German High Command continued to issue orders that bore no connection to reality. Maps showed arrows of advancement towards cities that were now unreachable. Requests for winter gear were delayed by bureaucratic confusion or simply ignored. The officers who tried to speak honestly about the conditions were dismissed as defeatists. The machine of war kept turning, even as its parts froze in place. In the Soviet lines, the story was different. There was no luxury, but there was purpose. Supply trains brought warm clothing, ammunition, and food. Fires burned openly in dugouts, and soldiers sang songs to keep morale alive. Each small victory, the recapture of a road, the destruction of a single tank, was celebrated. They were no longer just defending their homeland, they were reclaiming it. The Red Army's confidence grew, not because of numbers or equipment, but because they had adapted while the enemy had refused to. In one sector near Klin, Soviet scouts discovered a field of abandoned German tanks half covered by snow. Their steel surfaces glistened like silver in the faint winter light. The scouts approached cautiously, expecting an ambush. But there was nothing, no tracks, no movement, just the silent hulks of machines that had once terrified Europe. Some tanks still had markings of their units, others bore personal names painted by their crews. The scouts climbed onto the vehicles and peered inside. The interiors were empty, the instruments frozen, the controls immovable. One soldier knocked gently on the armor, and the hollow echo answered like a ghost. Word spread quickly among the troops. The invincible army had frozen in place. It became a kind of legend, a story told in whispers and laughter, that nature itself had joined the war, choosing sides without firing a shot. Soldiers called the scene the Cemetery of Steel. The Soviets photographed it, knowing what those images meant. Not just victory, but proof that even the most advanced weapons could be rendered useless when divorced from reality. For the Germans, the retreat westward was agony disguised as strategy. Every step backward felt like a confession. They told themselves they were regrouping, repositioning, conserving strength, but the truth was clear in their eyes. They were running. Behind them, they left the frozen symbols of a campaign that had overreached its limits. Yet amid the chaos, there were moments of humanity that defied the desolation. A Soviet medic shared bread with a captured German soldier. A group of Germans found shelter in a farmhouse and left food behind for the villagers when they moved on. These acts were small, fleeting, but they mattered. They were signs that even in the coldest winter of war, something warmer still existed, an instinct to recognize the other not as an enemy, but as another person enduring the same frozen world. By February, the front lines had stabilized again. Both armies dug into the snow, exhausted but unbroken. The Germans built bunkers with ice-thickened walls. The Soviets fortified positions with logs and earth. The war, for the moment, stood still. But beneath that stillness was movement, invisible, psychological, the slow shifting of belief. The Wehrmacht's aura of invincibility had cracked, and everyone, German, Soviet, and neutral alike, could feel it. In Berlin, the news was carefully rewritten. Speeches spoke of temporary adversity and heroic endurance against overwhelming odds. The pictures in newspapers showed smiling soldiers around campfires that didn't exist. But the families reading those papers knew. They recognized the silence between the lines, the absence of letters, the growing gaps in communication. The front had not only frozen, it had swallowed their sons. On the Soviet side, the winter of 1941-42 became a symbol of defiance. It entered folklore, songs, and stories. Children were told about the winter that saved Moscow. The image of the frozen tanks outside the city became as iconic as any victory parade, a reminder that sometimes survival itself is triumph. When spring finally came, it arrived quietly. The snow began to melt in slow streams that trickled through the trenches. The sound of dripping water was the first real music soldiers had heard in months. But with the thaw came revelation. Beneath the snow lay everything the cold had hidden: weapons, letters, photographs, and the remains of men who had not made it through the winter. The battlefield re-emerged, not as a place of glory, but as a graveyard of ambition. The Germans retreated further west, reorganizing, pretending it was part of the plan. The Soviets advanced cautiously, wary of overextension. Both sides understood that the war was far from over. But one truth had been permanently written into the frozen ground outside Moscow. The idea that technology and willpower could overcome nature was gone. The world had seen that even the most disciplined army could crumble when it refused to listen to the land it fought upon. The snow had melted, but its lesson remained, that arrogance, once frozen, does not thaw. The spring of 1942 crept across the Russian landscape like a cautious visitor. The snow retreated slowly, revealing the scars it had hidden for months: broken vehicles, shattered helmets, rifles half buried in mud. What had once been white and still was now a field of colorless ruin. The air smelled of thawed earth and rusting metal, and everywhere, the quiet hum of melting filled the silence that followed the storm. For the survivors, the change of season brought little comfort. The mud replaced the frost, swallowing boots and wheels alike. The same soldiers who had prayed for warmth now cursed it, their paths turning into rivers of sludge. Supply convoys bogged down, horses collapsed under weight, and engines that had survived the winter now drowned in the mire. It was as if nature had shifted from one form of resistance to another. The cold had frozen them in place, and now the mud refused to let them move. The frozen tanks that once dotted the landscape became islands in a new sea of mud. Their steel hulls, thawing under the weak sun, began to sink gradually into the softening ground. To passing soldiers, it looked like the earth itself was reclaiming them. The snow had entombed them. Now the soil was devouring them. Some crews tried to salvage what they could: bolts, tools, parts from the engines, but most machines were too damaged or buried to recover. They became landmarks for the weary armies moving past, silent reminders of a time when confidence had turned to disaster. In Berlin, new plans were being drawn. The leadership refused to see the Moscow campaign as failure. Instead, it was a pause before renewal. The new objective was in the south: oil, grain, and open terrain. The next operation would restore momentum, they promised. The propaganda machine began its work again, painting the winter as an unfortunate setback, a test of endurance that the German soldier had passed with honor. But those who had survived the frost knew better. They had looked into the face of something that no propaganda could explain, a force that had stripped them of illusion. When the orders for redeployment arrived, many soldiers greeted them with weary acceptance. Movement at least meant purpose. They cleaned what equipment they had left, patched uniforms with scavenged fabric, and prepared to march again. The frozen front near Moscow was abandoned, its relics left to rust and sink beneath the soil. Meanwhile, on the Soviet side, the tone was changing. For the first time since 1941, there was confidence, not just among soldiers but among civilians. Factories in the east worked day and night, producing weapons that would soon replace those lost in the early months of invasion. The Red Army, once disorganized and desperate, was now methodical and experienced. The winter had not only saved them, it had remade them. As the front shifted southward, war correspondents began visiting the former battlefields around Moscow. What they found would become legend. Dozens of tanks, standing in silence under the melting snow, their cannons tilted toward the sky as if in surrender. Some still bore faint traces of insignia. Others were stripped bare by scavengers. The sight was haunting. The reporters wrote about it with a mixture of awe and disbelief. A frozen army, defeated not by another army, but by the land itself. The photographs they took would later circle the world, showing a battlefield where nature had claimed victory without firing a single shot. Among the Soviet soldiers who visited those fields, the emotion was complex. There was pride, of course, but also humility. They understood that this victory was not entirely theirs. The cold, the distance, and the patience of the Russian land had fought alongside them. It was not triumph in the usual sense. It was endurance rewarded. When local villagers returned to their homes near the front, they found strange scenes. Barns full of frozen supplies, empty trenches carved into the hillsides, and tanks that seemed to rise out of the earth like monuments. Children played around them, climbing over the turrets, unaware that these machines had once brought fear across half of Europe. Adults gathered what they could: fuel, scrap metal, anything useful. But some of the tanks were left untouched, as if to remind everyone that this place had been a turning point. And in many ways, it was. For the first time since the war began, the world saw that the German advance could be stopped. The invincible had been made mortal. Diplomats in London and Washington studied the reports carefully, understanding what it meant, that the Eastern Front could hold, that resistance in Europe might yet prevail. The frozen fields of Russia had become more than a battleground. They were a symbol. Still, for the men who had lived through it, the memory remained sharper than any symbol. In later years, veterans of the campaign would rarely speak of it in public. They called it simply that winter. The details, the cold, the silence, the sight of the tanks frozen in place, were too vivid, too heavy to retell often. Many wrote about it only decades later, when time had turned memory into history. Their writings shared a common tone: disbelief at having survived, and respect for the power of the land that had nearly destroyed them. The frozen tanks of Moscow were not just relics of battle. They were warnings written in steel, that the laws of nature care nothing for human ambition, and that arrogance, once confronted by the world's indifference, leaves behind only silence. Even as the war moved south, the echo of that silence followed. Every plan, every advance, every confident speech carried the faint whisper of that winter, a whisper reminding those who had seen it that there are battles no strategy can win, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon is humility before the forces that cannot be controlled. As the armies moved south in 1942, the landscape changed, forests thinned, fields stretched wide, and the snow gave way to dust. But for the men who had endured the winter near Moscow, the memory of that frozen silence never left. They carried it with them like an invisible scar. When they looked at the new horizon, they no longer saw opportunity. They saw another test, another place where ambition might clash with reality. The German High Command spoke of a renewed campaign, a drive toward the oil fields of the Caucasus, the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. The promise was clear: capture these resources and the war could still be won. Maps were drawn with elegant precision, new lines of advance sweeping southward as if history itself could be redrafted by willpower. But behind the confident arrows lay the same weaknesses that had doomed the previous winter's offensive: overextension, hubris, and a refusal to learn. For the soldiers, it was déjà vu. They knew how it began: the speeches, the parades, the optimism, and they knew how it could end. The frozen tanks near Moscow had taught them that even the mightiest machine could become a monument overnight. Still, they obeyed. Orders were orders, and war allowed no space for reflection. As the summer offensive began, the terrain seemed almost merciful at first. The warmth returned, the skies cleared, and the fields bloomed. The soldiers called it the season of illusions. Engines roared again, and the convoys rolled across open plains. It was as if the army were trying to erase the memory of winter with movement, to convince itself that progress was still possible. But the echoes of the frost were everywhere. The new tanks, though improved, still bore the same mechanical fragility when pushed to their limits. Supply lines, stretched thin once more, repeated the same mistakes. The officers who had survived the winter tried to warn their superiors, but warnings were drowned out by confidence. This time, they were told, the weather is on our side. The irony was cruel. They had blamed the cold, not their planning. They had blamed nature, not arrogance. And so they marched again, unaware that they were heading toward another reckoning, one that would unfold not in snow, but in scorching heat. Meanwhile, the Soviets had learned. Every lesson from the frozen front was now a weapon. They built stronger logistics, trained commanders to adapt quickly, and spread deception through the enemy's lines. The Red Army no longer sought quick glory. It sought endurance, patience, and precision. It had become what its enemy once claimed to be. In Moscow, the fields of frozen tanks were now overgrown with grass. Some were dismantled for scrap, others stood untouched, monuments to the cost of overconfidence. Children played in their shadows, sliding down their hulls as though they were playgrounds. Villagers spoke of the winter with reverence, calling it the season that turned the tide. They didn't speak of tactics or generals. They spoke of the snow, the frost, and the silence that had stopped the unstoppable. Foreign journalists who visited the site wrote that it felt less like a battlefield and more like a graveyard of iron. Birds nested inside open hatches. Grass grew through the cracks of frozen treads. The machines that had once embodied power now embodied stillness. Nature was reclaiming its balance, piece by piece, from the inventions that had once scarred it. One correspondent described standing beside a Panzer that had sunk half into the mud. Its gun pointed upward toward the grey sky, like a question left unanswered. He wrote, "The earth here does not forget. It buries arrogance first, and only later, the wreckage." That sentiment echoed far beyond Russia. Military theorists studied the winter campaign as a lesson in limits, a reminder that logistics and preparation mattered more than ideology. Psychologists studied it as an example of collective denial, of how an entire command structure could convince itself that nature could be conquered by will alone. The phrase General Winter entered the vocabulary of history, but those who had been there knew the truth. It wasn't the winter that had won. It was the refusal of one side to listen. Back in the south, as the summer wore on, the German advance began to slow. The heat brought new hardships. Engines overheated, dust filled lungs, and rivers ran dry. The soldiers joked bitterly that they were being punished by the seasons, frozen one year and burned the next. They understood that the war had become something cyclical, an endless exchange of extremes that wore down everything human inside them. Letters home once again became shorter. "We are alive," they said. "We move, but we do not advance." The language of conquest had been replaced by the language of endurance. Even victory, if it came, no longer meant what it once had. In quiet moments between battles, men spoke softly about the winter. They remembered the stillness, the beauty of the snow under moonlight, and the way the frost had silenced the guns. For all its suffering, that memory had a strange purity. The war in the south, with its heat, dust, and chaos, felt dirtier, less noble, more desperate. Some said the cold had cleansed them, while the summer now corrupted everything it touched. And far behind them, the frozen tanks remained, half buried, rusting, silent. They no longer belonged to any army or nation. They belonged to time. Every passing month covered them with a new layer of history, until they became less about a specific battle and more about what the war itself represented: humanity's attempt to control forces far greater than itself. When autumn came again, the leaves began to fall around those same silent machines. The wind moved through their hollow frames, creating a low, metallic hum. Some said it sounded like whispers, the voices of those who had once believed they could not fail. The frozen tanks no longer marked defeat. They marked revelation. By 1943, the front lines had moved far from the frozen ruins outside Moscow, yet their shadow lingered. The war had changed, its rhythm slower, its tone darker. The swift conquests of the early years were gone, replaced by exhaustion, attrition, and a kind of grim inevitability. Soldiers fought not with the expectation of glory, but with the quiet hope of survival. Every man on both sides carried ghosts from the winter, not just of comrades lost, but of the silence that had shown them the limits of control. The frozen tanks had become symbols, not of failure, but of warning. Military planners studied the campaign endlessly, searching for lessons that might rewrite the future. They drew lines on maps with renewed caution, aware now that no amount of strategy could overcome the land's indifference. For every new offensive, there was hesitation in the air, the memory of engines that would not start, of fuel frozen solid, of plans that collapsed under the weight of ice. The war had humbled even its architects. In Germany, the official narrative still insisted on strength. Posters and speeches spoke of determination, of destiny, of victory through sacrifice. But beneath the slogans, an unspoken truth spread among soldiers and civilians alike, that the war was slipping from human hands. It no longer felt like a story being written by generals. It felt like something elemental: fire, ice, and time grinding everything down. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, the frozen victory of 1941-42 had become part of national identity. It was told in schools, sung in songs, and engraved in monuments. But it was not triumphalism, it was remembrance. The people knew that the frost had not spared them easily. They had suffered just as deeply, and their victory had come not from invulnerability but from endurance. The frozen tanks outside Moscow became sacred ruins, left deliberately untouched. Farmers plowed their fields around them. Children placed flowers at their tracks each winter. They were not relics of an enemy, but reminders of a struggle that had defined them all. War correspondents returned to those same fields in 1943, curious to see what remained. They found that most of the tanks were still there, though changed by time. Rust spread like moss across the armor, and small trees grew from open hatches. The ground beneath them had thawed, sunk, and shifted, tilting the once-straight vehicles at odd angles. The sun caught their metal in flashes of bronze and copper, transforming them into accidental sculptures. Some soldiers stopped to touch them as they passed, not out of victory, but respect. These machines, once tools of domination, had become monuments to human frailty. Back at the front, the war continued its relentless turn. The Battle of Stalingrad erupted with a ferocity that made even veterans of Moscow shudder. There, once again, the lessons of the frozen front were repeated. Supply lines stretched too thin, soldiers trapped in climates they did not understand, arrogance clashing with endurance. The same mistakes re-emerged, dressed in new geography. And yet, every time, The memory of that first winter whispered through the ranks. Remember what happens when you forget the land. By now, both armies had become experts in survival. The Soviets built entire field systems for winter warfare, mobile kitchens, insulated bunkers, camouflage nets woven from frost-resistant fabric. The Germans, having learned too late, now issued fur-lined coats and winterized oil for engines. But the spirit was different. The Red Army fought with confidence born from familiarity, while the Wehrmacht fought with caution born from fear. In the villages once occupied by the Germans, life returned slowly. Farmers unearthed tank tracks while plowing, and children found rusted shells buried in the fields. Every discovery carried a story. The people did not curse the machines. They pitied them, as if they were living creatures caught in a struggle they could not comprehend. The war, to them, had become less about nations and more about survival against something far larger, the collision between human ambition and the world's indifference. Historians would later write that the frozen campaign outside Moscow marked the true turning point of the war. Not because of territorial gains or losses, but because it redefined what both sides understood about endurance. It was no longer about who had the most weapons or the most men, but about who could adapt, who could listen to the silence, who could survive not just the enemy, but the environment itself. Even decades later, veterans spoke of that winter in the same way sailors spoke of storms, not as something fought, but as something endured. They remembered the color of the sky, the taste of snow on their lips, the sound of wind moving through empty tanks. Some said they could still feel the cold in their bones each winter, as if the frost had entered them permanently. In Germany, the memory of that winter became a quiet wound. Monuments were built not to victories, but to endurance and loss. In small towns, plaques bore the names of soldiers who had never returned from the Russian front. Their families kept faded photographs, knowing only that their loved ones had vanished somewhere east of Moscow. For them, the frozen tanks were more than historical relics. They were the last known witnesses. In Russia, the same tanks stood as proof of resilience. Some were moved to museums, others remained untouched in the fields, where they became part of the landscape. Grass grew over their tracks, snow settled inside their turrets, and birds built nests where shells had once been stored. Nature had reclaimed them completely. And yet, every spring, when the snow melted and the metal gleamed faintly in the sun, the locals still paused to look. The machines no longer frightened anyone. They had become part of the soil, absorbed by the land they had once sought to conquer. The frozen front had ended years ago, but its silence still spoke, not of armies or politics, but of proportion. It whispered that even in the age of machines and empires, the earth remains the oldest force of all, patient and absolute. When the war finally ended, it did not bring the clear silence of peace, only a quieter kind of exhaustion. Across Europe, ruins smoked and cities rebuilt, but in the vast expanse of Russia, the fields that had once held frozen tanks remained undisturbed. They were left as they had been, half-buried and weathered, too heavy to move and too meaningful to destroy. The land seemed to have chosen to keep them, as if to remember on its own terms. 4 years after, travelers and farmers would stumble upon these silent sentinels. Some stood upright, their cannons pointing skyward like broken monuments. Others had sunk into the mud, leaving only a hint of metal beneath the grass. In the summer, wildflowers grew around them. In winter, snow once again covered their outlines, restoring them briefly to the way they had been in 1941, still, white, and eternal. People began to tell stories about them. In nearby villages, it was said that the tanks sang when the wind blew through their hollow frames. Children dared one another to touch their cold armor, believing that to do so would bring luck. Old men spoke of how they had seen those same tanks once roar across the horizon, unstoppable, and how now they stood motionless, conquered not by another army, but by the patience of the land. Historians came, too. They photographed, measured, and catalogued, but often they left in silence. There was something about standing among those machines, something humbling. You could trace your hand across the steel and feel the boundary between human design and natural decay. It was not merely rusting metal. It was history dissolving into the earth that had outlasted it. In time, the frozen tanks near Moscow became more than relics. They became mirrors. Each generation saw something different in them. To veterans, they were memories of endurance and futility. To the young, they were lessons in humility. To the land itself, they were just another layer, one more story buried beneath centuries of snow and soil. Museums requested that some be moved, preserved, displayed. A few were lifted from the earth, restored, and placed behind glass. Visitors looked at them through reflection, reading placards that told of frostbite, broken engines, and stalled ambition. But those who had stood in the real fields knew that no museum could capture their meaning. The tanks belonged where they had fallen, between the human world and the natural one, half reclaimed by both. As decades passed, the metal continued to fade. Paint peeled, bolts loosened, and nature filled the gaps. Moss crept along the edges, and in the spring, birds nested inside the hollow barrels. Life had returned in its own quiet way, replacing noise with continuity. What had once symbolized domination now hosted the fragile persistence of life. It was not revenge, it was restoration. Writers and poets came to the site and tried to put it into words. Some described it as a monument to failure, others as a testament to endurance. One called it the place where time won. Another wrote, "Here, even machines learn to rest." None of them were entirely wrong. The frozen tanks had become something beyond interpretation, a moment in history when nature and humanity had met in their purest contrast. For the few survivors who returned years later, standing before those same vehicles felt like meeting an old version of themselves. They would place a hand on the rusted steel and remember the sound of the engines, the endless white horizon, the way silence had swallowed everything. Some wept. Others simply stood there, their breath fogging in the cold air, as if waiting for the machines to answer. No answers came. Only the same silence, patient and deep. By the time the century turned, the tanks were barely visible from the road. Grass had swallowed their forms, and only careful eyes could distinguish them from the hills. Yet for those who knew where to look, the shapes were unmistakable, gentle mounds where once there had been steel and fire. The land had forgiven them. In the end, the frozen tanks outside Moscow became not just symbols of a single war, but of every human attempt to outpace the natural world. They reminded those who saw them that progress without humility is fragile, and that even the strongest creations fade when they stand against the quiet strength of time. When the wind moves across those fields today, it carries a sound that is almost like a whisper, faint, metallic, and eternal. It is not the echo of battle, but of memory. A reminder that the world endures not through conquest, but through balance. The tanks remain there still, silent beneath the seasons. Not as trophies, not as ruins, but as teachers. And in that silence, colder than any winter, older than any war, the lesson continues to speak.